Hello, on behalf of KFF, it's my pleasure to welcome you today to the KFF webinar on Americans' knowledge and attitudes about abortion access and the pending Supreme Court ruling. I'm Alina Selganikoff, a Senior Vice President and Director of Women's Health Policy at KFF. Today, we're going to focus on an issue that's foremost on the minds of many people across the country. That is the future of abortion in the United States. We are all anticipating that in the next few weeks, we're going to learn about the Supreme Court's final decision on the case challenging Mississippi's 15-week abortion ban, Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health. Just a few weeks ago, Politico obtained and released a leaked draft of the High Court's majority opinion written by Justice Alito that would overturn Roe v. Wade, the nearly 50-year-old ruling that established a constitutional right to abortion in the United States. If this draft is predictive of the court's final ruling, then we are likely to see abortion banned in huge swaths of the South and the Midwestern United States. This is a ruling that abortion opponents have long sought and that abortion supporters have long feared. Next slide, please. Today, we're privileged to hear from two KFF experts, Ashley Kurtzinger and Lori Sobel. Ashley is the Director of Survey Methodology and Associate Director for Public Opinion and Survey Research, and will provide us with key findings from the survey that we just fielded weeks ago on public opinion about abortion policies and the implications of the ruling on voter engagement in the upcoming midterm election. Ashley will be followed by Lori Sobel, Associate Director of Women's Health Policy. Lori is going to give an overview of the likely paths states will take should the court overturn Roe, sending the decision regarding whether to ban, limit, or protect the right to abortion back to the states. Next slide, please. I want to let you know that this briefing is being recorded and that the link to the recorded version along with the report of the survey findings will be emailed to everyone later today. We will also have time to answer your questions, both about the survey and also about what might happen following the ruling. Questions should be entered using the Q&A function, and that can be sent at any time during the discussion. Next slide. Before we get started, however, I did want to go over some abortion basics, especially in light of the sizable abortion and knowledge gap that we identified in our survey. In the US, most abortions occur early in pregnancy. Nearly 8 to 10 are obtained in the first 9 weeks of pregnancy, and about 1% occur after 21 weeks. And according to both the Guttmacher Institute and the CDC, that are the primary national sources of abortion data in the US, the abortion rate has been following, although according to the CDC, there was a small uptake in 2018 and 2019. In addition, recent data from the Guttmacher Institute finds that medication abortions, that is abortions using a regimen of mifepristone and misoprostol pills, now account for over half of abortions in the United States. Mifepristone, also known as RU486, was approved by the FDA 20 years ago as a safe and effective abortifacient. Next slide, please. We know that people who are low income, women of color, young people, and those who have had prior births constitute the majority of people who get abortions in the US. As an aside, I did want to acknowledge that while we use the term women in the presentation and the survey, we recognize that there are people across the gender spectrum who may not identify as women, but have the capacity to get pregnant and may also seek abortion services. Next slide, please. And while we are all currently laser focused on the future of abortion, I think it's important to recognize that abortion is the most highly regulated medical procedure in the nation today. In addition to all the other standard rules and policies that regulate the provision of healthcare and medical procedures, there are numerous abortion-specific regulations that states have enacted that effectively restrict access to abortions. These range from requiring waiting periods, sometimes up to 72 hours, to parental consent and notification requirements for minors, as well as requirements that unsubstantiated and false information about the risks of abortion be provided to those seeking abortion services. An area that has been particularly active in the past couple of years is our state's efforts to ban abortions via telehealth. That is, when a pregnant person is able to obtain a medication abortion pill by mail after having a telehealth visit with a clinician. While this approach has been found to be comparable to in-person care by numerous studies, many states have enacted policies that limit the availability of telehealth abortions, including bans on mailing medication abortion, requiring in-person ultrasounds, or blocking advanced practice clinicians, such as nurse practitioners and physician assistants from dispensing medication. Next slide, please. And finally, before I turn to Ashley, I did want to quickly refresh you about what the Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health case is about. The court is considering a law out of Mississippi that bans abortions after 15 weeks. Some were surprised that the court took the case because the law is in blatant violation of Roe v. Wade, the case that established the constitutional right to abortion up to the point of viability, that is roughly 24 weeks. The state of Mississippi is asking the court to overturn Roe v. Wade. And as I mentioned earlier, a leaked draft majority opinion suggests that this may be the path that the court will take, particularly given the strong 6-3 conservative majority of the court. As of today, the court is expected to issue 29 more rulings this term, which typically ends at the end of June. With that, I'm now going to turn to Ashley Kurtzinger, who's going to provide an overview of the key findings of the survey, and then she will be followed by Lori Sobel, who will discuss likely state actions and discuss legal and legislative issues likely to emerge from the decision. Next slide, please.
Thanks, Elena. The latest KFF health tracking poll was conducted the week after the leaked draft of the Supreme Court opinion on Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health. Our goal was really to provide an update on our long history of polling on national and state level reproductive health care policy. This includes current attitudes towards Roe v. Wade, but also so much more. We were interested in the reverberation of the probable overturning of Roe within the public. We also wanted to look at support for other policies that will become even more prevalent in states if Roe is overturned. And finally, we wanted to get a better sense of whether this probable Supreme Court decision would motivate voters in the upcoming midterm elections, and if so, how. First, a few details on the poll. The poll was conducted among a nationally representative probability-based sample of 1,537 adults over the phone and online. Because we wanted to provide deeper dives into the population most directly impacted by these policies, we conducted an oversample of women between the ages of 18 and 49. The field work was conducted by SSRS, and the margin of error for the full sample is 3 percentage points. We are proud charter members of the APOR Transparency Initiative, so please do not hesitate to contact us if you have questions about our methodology. Next slide. I'm sure most people in this webinar felt like news of the leaked opinion and the implications were everywhere in the days and really weeks after it was published in Politico. Well, the poll finds that most of the public say they have heard at least some about this leaked draft opinion, and most are aware that it is likely that the Supreme Court will overturn Roe v. Wade this year. In this slide, we look at the reactions to this news. The green colors represent negative emotions, and the blue colors represent positive emotions. As you can see, reactions to the news vary sharply, with most Democrats saying they would feel angry or sad if Roe was overturned, while most Republicans say they would feel hopeful. The most dominant emotion among women was also sad, including more than 6 in 10 younger women reporting they would feel sad if the Supreme Court were to issue a final decision overturning Roe and allow states to ban abortion. The next slide shows 2 different data points. First, overall attitudes on overturning Roe represented by the bars on the left. This is something that we've been measuring for well over our decade, and our measure has consistently found about 2/3 of the public do not want to see Roe overturned. Interestingly, this remained relatively unchanged after the news from the Supreme Court. Views towards Roe are sharply divided by partisan, with majorities of Democrats and independents not wanting to see it overturned, while 6 in 10 Republicans say they want the Supreme Court to overturn Roe. The second set of the bars on the right show where people fall on whether they think getting an abortion should be a personal choice or something that is regulated by law. And once again, there is a strong partisan divide looking at that second set of bars. But with most Democrats and independents saying it should be a personal choice, while Republicans are more divided. But I want to call out the last row of bars, which looks at Republican women specifically, and shows that while most Republican women want Roe overturned, a majority also think abortion should be a personal choice. I think this chart overall, as well as looking at the specific subgroup of Republican women, shows the nuances of people's opinions on abortions. Most journalists and pollsters have a hard time explaining the complexity of people's opinions on abortion, but this is a great example. People can both support overturning Roe and at the same time think abortion should largely be a personal choice. Another point that help explains this is if we look at whether people want abortion to be legal or illegal, in our poll and many other finds, very few people are on the extreme spectrums, with few saying it should be illegal in all cases and few people saying it should be legal in all cases. That's where the complexity lies. And if Roe is overturned, the availability and legality of abortion will vary from state to state. So we were also interested in looking at whether people knew if abortions would be illegal or remain legal in their state if Roe was overturned, and what state level restrictions people supported. Next slide. As Alina alluded to, and Lori will talk a lot more about, many states are already preparing for the impending Supreme Court ruling and defining what a post-Roe world will look like in their state. Yet if we look at people living in states where they have a law already in place that would ban abortion immediately if Roe is overturned, called a trigger law, or if they still have a pre-Roe abortion ban in place, we find that most don't realize that if Roe is overturned, abortions would no longer be available in their state. About 4 in 10, so 45% in that bright blue section of that top bar, are aware that if Roe is overturned, abortion will no longer be legal in their state. As you can see, a slightly larger share of women ages 18 to 49 in those states, 55%, are aware. On the other hand, 2/3 of those living in states where the right to an abortion is explicitly protected are aware that abortion would continue to be legal if the case was overturned. Next slide. This slide shows that among the public, there is some support for certain state level restrictions on women seeking abortions, but majorities of the public oppose criminalizing women, doctors, or people who assist with those seeking abortion care. It is important to note that on many of these issues, attitudes are malleable, and with additional information, or if people are inundated with messaging from one side of the argument, their attitudes may shift. It is also easier for people to support legislation in the abstract, but we know that once policies get closer to becoming actual law, support may decline. But with all those caveats in place, we find that 2/3 of the public support laws requiring women to wait 24 hours between meeting with a healthcare provider and getting an abortion. In addition, more than half of adults support requiring nearly all private health insurance plans to cover the cost of abortions. Smaller shares support laws banning abortions after the time in which fetal cardiac activity can be detected, which is around 6 weeks of a pregnancy. And large majorities oppose making it a crime for doctors to perform abortions, making it a crime for women to get abortions, or make it a crime for women to cross state lines to get abortions. Most also oppose allowing private citizens to sue people who provide or assist with abortions, like the law in Texas. I also wanted to note that we look at support for these policies in places where there are trigger laws or pre-Roe abortion bans, and find majorities oppose criminalizing doctors, criminalizing women for crossing state lines, and criminalizing women for getting an abortion in those states. But support is not uniform, as the next slide shows. A majority of Republicans support both a 24-hour waiting period and prohibiting abortions once there is cardiac activity. These two are highlighted with the red circles on the right column. In addition, the red line shows that about half of Republicans now support making it a crime for doctors to perform abortions that would result in fines or prison time. Fewer support, even among Republicans, criminalizing abortions. In addition to measuring support for abortion policies, our polling also takes a look at common misconceptions and lack of knowledge around abortion procedures in this country. Next slide. As Alina discussed previously, there is a lot of misconceptions and lack of knowledge around abortion procedures in the country. That is despite the fact that 2/3 of adults say they personally know someone, including themselves, who may have had an abortion. About half of adults incorrectly say that less than 10% of women in the US have had an abortion, when the actual share is closer to 1/4. And most people don't know at what point in a pregnancy most abortions will occur. Perhaps most interesting, while medication abortion now accounts for more than half of all abortions in the US, fewer than 3 in 10 adults say they have heard of the medication abortion pill. Younger women are more likely than older women and men to say they have heard of this pill, though. And while most adults, 92%, have heard of emergency contraceptive pills, Plan B, and while they say they know it is not the same as medication abortion, a substantial share, 73%, incorrectly think that these pills can end a pregnancy in its early stages. This is just one example of the misconceptions out there. Next slide. And finally, we take a look at how all of this could play a role in the 2022 midterm elections. I don't think it is a surprise to anyone that this election seems to be largely about the economy, most notably inflation. Poll after poll, including our own, shows that this is the top issue for voters and one that the Republican Party historically does better on than Democrats. But could the Supreme Court overturning Roe shift any voters? I think this is especially interesting to think about if we think about how historically we have talked about single issue abortion voters. For the past several decades, if someone was referring to a voter as a single issue abortion voter, they were most likely conservative and supporting candidates who wanted to limit abortion access. Our latest polling finds that about a third of voters say that if the Supreme Court were to issue a final decision overturning Roe, they would be more motivated to vote in the 2022 midterm elections. Unsurprisingly, these voters tend to look more Democratic. But if we look at voters who are motivated and what type of candidates they would support, we find that there's about 1 in 5 who said they would be more motivated to vote. They wanted candidates who want to protect access to abortion, and they would not vote for a candidate who disagrees with them on this issue. This is compared to 4% of voters who are, once again, more motivated to vote, but they only want to vote for candidates who want to limit access. So there appears to be a 16 percentage point swing in enthusiasm between these pro-choice and pro-life voters. Next slide. And if we look at this by key demographic groups of voters, I want to draw your attention to the last set of bars, where we have women voters broken out by party ID. 4 in 10 Democratic women voters say they are more motivated to vote and they would only support pro-choice candidates, compared to 10% of Republican women who say they are more motivated to vote and they would only support pro-life candidates. So listen, it's June, and I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. And we don't even have a Supreme Court decision, and so much can change in the next 5 months. And this election is largely going to be about the economy. But there is some indication that overturning Roe could change how we think and describe single issue abortion voters in the upcoming midterm elections, and may increase turnout among Democratic leaning voters, at least at the margins. Finally, I want to leave you with some quotes from voters about how abortion plays into their voting decisions. Next slide. Clearly, this is an issue in which people's opinions on can be central to their own identities. But the truth is that most people have little knowledge about abortion procedures in this country. They don't really understand what a Supreme Court overturning Roe will mean for abortion access in their own state, and mostly believe abortion is a personal choice, and that but that doesn't mean they don't support some restrictions. And with that, I will turn it over to my colleague, Lori.
Thank you, Ashley. Next slide, please. I'm going to walk through some of the likely impacts of Roe being overturned and the actions states have already taken and may take. Since 1973, states have not been allowed to ban abortion before viability, which is around 24 weeks. While states have been permitted to regulate abortion before viability, the court has reviewed these restrictions and blocked those that created an undue burden for people seeking abortion care. If the court overturns Roe, there will basically be three options. Some states will ban abortion, some states will protect the right to abortion, and this middle option does not get discussed a lot, but there are states, as Alina pointed out, that may not outright ban abortion, but will make it so restricted that access will be extremely limited. Next slide, please. So this is a map of the 17 states that either have pre-Roe bans or have trigger laws, which would make abortion illegal pretty soon after the decision overturning Roe, if that is the decision that comes out. Next slide, please. In addition to those 17 states, there are an additional 4 states that have gestational bans that could be implemented shortly after a decision. Georgia, South Carolina, and Ohio have 6 weeks bans that have been temporarily blocked by courts. And Florida has recently passed a 15-week ban that is scheduled to go into effect July 1st. Next slide, please. On the other side, we have these 16 states in DC that have protected the right to abortion. Next slide, please. Some of these 16 states have been passing new laws to preserve and expand access to abortion. States have been passing these laws at a very rapid pace, and it's quite a chore to keep up with it. So I will run through some examples, but this is by no means an exhaustive list. These laws fall into a few categories. The first category are laws to protect clinicians and protect pregnant people from civil and criminal liability imposed by other states banning abortion. Connecticut has passed this type of law. California, New York, and Washington are considering similar bills. As a part of these efforts, states are seeking to bolster the privacy protections for medical information. States are also looking at ways to fund clinics and people seeking abortion care. This can be done through insurance. 5 states currently have requirement for fully insured plans to cover abortion without any cost sharing. These states are California, Illinois, Maryland, New York, and Oregon. Oregon has also created a fund to help individuals seeking abortion care and organizations that provide the care. California is considering a similar bill. States are also expanding the kinds of clinicians who can provide care and provide training to clinicians. California, Delaware, Connecticut, Maryland, and Washington have recently passed these types of laws, and Maryland has also created an abortion training fund. States are also trying to address the disinformation that is circulated, and as reflected in our poll, many people confuse emergency contraception with medication abortion and lack basic knowledge about medication abortion. Next slide, please. The states colored in this map do not have any explicit laws that either protect abortion rights or ban abortion. However, we can get an idea of what might happen in these states by looking at how many abortion restrictions they have already enacted. We reviewed 7 main categories of abortion restrictions. These are counseling requirements, waiting period, ultrasound requirements, parental notification and consent requirements, gestational limits, restrictions on insurance coverage on abortion, and regulations on facilities or clinicians providing abortions. These states might have other restrictions in addition to the ones we reviewed, but looking at this map, the ones in the dark brown have 6 or 7 of the ones that we identified. The states in the orange have 3 to 5, and the light tan states have 2 or fewer of these restrictions. So we would expect the states with more restrictions to not protect abortion access. Next slide, please. If the Supreme Court overrules Roe v. Wade and removes the federal constitutional protection for abortion, then future litigation about abortion regulations will likely be in state courts. 6 states that do not have explicit laws protecting abortion have state Supreme Court decisions establishing a right to abortion in the state constitution. Alaska, Minnesota, and Montana fall into this category. Interestingly, Florida, which, as I mentioned, has passed a 15-week ban, also has a similar state court decision, as does Iowa with a blocked 6-week ban. Kansas has a state Supreme Court decision as well, and also has a constitutional amendment on the ballot this year that is trying to counteract that state Supreme Court decision. In addition to Kansas, there is activity in Colorado and Kentucky to have a constitutional amendment to ban abortion. There are 4 states that are in the process to consider constitutional amendments to protect abortion that are Arizona, California, Michigan, and Vermont. Next slide, please. In the states that will ban abortion, the penalties will vary. Some states will impose criminal penalties, including jail time, and some states that have passed laws with civil penalties, like in Texas and Oklahoma, might keep those laws as an additional way to enforce bans, even when they're allowed to make it a criminal penalty. Idaho passed a similar law that is currently blocked with civil penalties, and other states, including Alabama, Louisiana, Missouri, Ohio, and Tennessee, are considering similar bills. It's very unclear at the moment how states will try and prosecute for abortions happening outside of their states, and how they would enforce these penalties. As I mentioned before, in reaction, some of the states seeking to protect abortion are passing bills to protect clinicians and people seeking services from civil and criminal liabilities from other states. Next slide, please. So where are we? After, if the court does issue a decision overturning Roe v. Wade, access to abortion will continue to depend on where you live. As Alina stated at the beginning, it already varies quite a bit, but there will be huge swaths of the country that will have no access to abortion. The states will really be in the driver's seat, and the outcome of the midterm elections will affect abortion access in a handful of states. Some people will turn to medication abortion or self-managed options, but this will only provide abortion access to those early in their pregnancy. Many people will have to travel long distances, some over state borders, some over national borders, but some people won't be able to travel. They won't be able to afford the abortion care or the travel, or be able to take time off from work or from family responsibilities. Congressional action on this issue is very unlikely to pass, and the administration does not have a lot of pathways. The need for accurate, reliable information about abortion and contraception will grow and will be challenged by ongoing disinformation efforts. So with that, I will turn it back over to Alina to moderate the question and answer.
Thank you so much for that, Lori and Ashley. I know we have just thrown a lot of information at you, at the audience. I do want to encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A to follow up. I'm going to get us started a little bit. Lori, you focused most of your comments on state responses and mentioned that there are few options for Congress and the administration in the short term. Can you talk a little bit about what's been done with Congress and the Biden administration
Sure.
as they've been moving forward?
So there was the Women's Health Protection Act, which just didn't get enough votes, but that bill sought to protect abortion at the federal level. Just yesterday, Senator Warren, with some other Senate Democrats, sent a letter to the administration urging some executive action on abortion, and their suggestions were to increase access to and information about medication abortion, providing resources to individuals who need to travel, establishing a reproductive health ombudsman at the Health and Human Services, clarifying protections for health and location data, because there's a lot of information out there about people being scared that using different apps on their cell phone might get them into criminal trouble depending on the laws in their states. And then lastly, using federal property to increase access to abortions. It's not clear if the administration will take any of these actions and if they'll be challenged if they do.
Great, thank you. And this one is for Ashley. Ashley, you've been involved with KFF tracking polls for several years now, and you've seen an awful lot about public opinion regarding a wide range of health policy topics. Can you talk a little bit about what finding, if any, surprised you on this poll?
Yeah, we've been polling on all these different topics and been polling on abortion and reproductive health for several decades as well. I think what was the most surprising to me in this poll is not something that we have seen in our previous polling, and it really came out in this question about whether they want a candidate who will protect access to abortion or limit access to abortion. And we saw a huge age divide even among men. We'd seen that age divide among women, with women 18 to 49 much more likely to say that they would support a candidate who wants to protect access, but now we're seeing it among men. And so it's unclear if this is a generational divide, if something like that this generation will then think about in this direction as we go forward. But it is showing that there is a very strong age divide, with younger men and younger women much more likely to say that they support candidates who want to maintain access. I should also note, younger Republicans, they are more likely to support a candidate who wants to limit access, but not at the same level as those older Republicans. So it is showing that there's something happening there with the age divide. It may be that because for the majority of their lives, they've had access to abortion. And so that is the status quo. We know, there's a preference to the status quo. And so it'll be interesting to see if Roe is overturned, how this could shift this, or whether this generation divide exists.
Thank you. We have some questions on medication abortion and can it be delivered across state lines, across telehealth? And, Lori, this is one of the issues we've talked about on some of what are the kind of gray areas that have emerged. Can you talk a little bit about some of the legal implications of, these types of state laws, should they be passed and enacted?
Sure. So I think there was two questions in there. The first was maybe just about medication abortion.
Yeah.
So the FDA up until very recently had protocols for the dispensing of mifepristone, requiring that it be dispensed in person. And that was the enforcement of that was lifted during the pandemic, and that rule was officially lifted last December. And so now, from the federal standpoint, mifepristone can be mailed and delivered not in person. As we know, some states have their own regulations and laws prohibiting that. And clearly, if states are seeking to ban abortion, that would be included in that. So what's being set up is basically a big fight between, where does the FDA's authority to regulate mifepristone start and end, and where does state rules around banning abortion start and end, and the conflict between the two. So, and there is an ongoing case right now in Mississippi with this exact question, and it's because it's in Mississippi, it's called Gen Biopro v. Dobbs. So that's the other Dobbs case. And so there's a lot of, issues around that preemption, the use of mail, wrapped up in that legal issue. And then in terms of how far states can go to regulate their state laws in other states is really a very gray area at the moment. I mean, typically states can regulate what happens in their states and not what happens outside of their states, but we're seeing a lot of states trying to aggressively regulate what their residents do outside of their state borders. And we just really don't know right now. And so we see, as I mentioned, some of the states seeking to protect abortion, setting up laws to counteract those and to protect the clinicians in their state, as well as people who are seeking care in their states. So it's a big gray area right now.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think the lawyers will be very busy in the years to come. Ashley, I want to say one of the findings that struck me, and we didn't get into a whole lot of detail today, but I encourage people to look at the survey results, was just such a general lack of knowledge regarding basic facts about abortion. And, we got a question here about where do people get their information? Do we know about that? But I also wondered, how does this compare to other issues that we've tracked and looked at, COVID, prescription drug costs, the ACA? How does the degree of misinformation about abortion compare to some of the other policy issues that we've been tracking over time?
Well, I think everyone knows that misinformation on health issues is a huge problem, and we saw that exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's twofold. First, most people don't really think a lot about abortion. I imagine the people on this webinar do, but most people don't think a lot about abortion until they or a loved one or a family member or a close friend needs to get an abortion. And so that's really when they start learning about abortion access in their state and try to understand limitations and restrictions that may exist. And so, and additionally, historically, talking about abortion has been a taboo issue. So people haven't freely shared their abortion experience, even with close family members. That's lessening to some degree, but it does seem that, lack of talking about this with your close friends and families, plus the fact that most people aren't having to seek this type of information, leads to an environment that's ripe for misinformation and disinformation campaigns. I mean, this lack of knowledge around abortion procedures and policies in the US is not anything new. We've been studying this for the past decade, and it hasn't gotten better, it hasn't gotten worse, but it does lead to an environment where people are really prone to messaging campaigns that could manipulate their opinions or their attitudes towards abortion policy. And so I think that that's what's really at play here.
Yeah, and I think even in some cases where you have, very little in terms of sex education being taught, or it's very uneven. And I think particularly the stigma around abortion really makes this even more prone to misinformation or.
Yeah, I'm not sure that sex education is talking about abortion.
No, exactly. Yeah, exactly. We have a question here I'm going to lob this one to Lori about policies in neighboring countries. I think one of the things, I've read some things about now people going to Mexico and Canada. Can you talk a little bit about what you think we might see?
Yeah, I mean, I think people will travel to Mexico if that's the closest place for them to access an abortion. There's also the mailing of medication abortion from overseas. And so there's a few websites where people can go on and either have some type of telehealth visit and then have the medication mailed to them. And that's going to be harder for states to regulate because they're outside of our country. And so the states aren't going to be able to necessarily stop those services from being provided. And then, yes, I mean, abortion around the world generally has become more available. And if the Supreme Court issues a decision overturning Roe, we would be an outlier in terms of how the world is moving in terms of abortion access.
And then I'm going to get into a little bit of a detail because this is, I know, something that you kind of really looked at was what's happening in Michigan with abortion. We got a question here about, does it have a trigger ban? What's the status of what's been going on? And I know it's a little complicated.
So Michigan had a pre-Roe ban, and their governor brought a lawsuit saying that she thought the pre-Roe ban violated their state constitution, and the court agreed with her temporarily. So the pre-Roe ban is on hold right now while that litigation continues. So nothing would immediately happen after the decision in Michigan. Michigan also has a ballot measure to protect abortion on their ballot this year, or I think it's in process. I'm not sure if it's actually on the ballot yet.
And Ashley, this is for you. People were asking, do we plan to do another round of research on attitudes after the SCOTUS decision?
Absolutely. I think, this is kind of our first look at the role that the Supreme Court case may be playing in abortion attitudes and access and support for some of these state policies. I imagine this is going to be a major focus of our polling in the next couple of years, depending on whether the Supreme Court does what we all think it's going to do. So,
thanks. And Lori, this is a question about privacy. Do you know about whether there's a variation in state privacy laws? I know this is an area that states might have and kind of what impact that might have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of what the states who are seeking to protect abortion are trying to bolster their privacy laws, particularly around medical privacy. And it will become an interplay between, if I've received services in California and I'm from Texas and Texas thinks that I've done something illegal, can they go in and grab my medical record from California? So there's going to be a lot of interstate fighting around which law applies. And it will become even more complicated if I'm located in Texas and receiving a telehealth visit in Texas, Texas probably has more domain in that case to regulate what I'm doing if I'm actually located in Texas.
I know there's been so much interest and concern around privacy and medical records, and now everybody's running around with apps and period apps and looking at searches. I think this kind of now raises those privacy concerns to a whole other level.
Definitely.
And then another question about self-managed abortions and what do we think we're going to see in terms of what's going to happen? If you could talk a little bit about what a self-managed abortion is and
Sure.
How safe or unsafe those may be.
So, I mean, just to set the record, like we're not looking at coat hangers. We're looking at people obtaining medication abortion through maybe a site that, as I mentioned before, these sites that will mail them from overseas or from going to Mexico, or just going to a neighboring state. So it's, if you obtain them through a visit with a clinician, then that's considered an abortion within the scope of practice that, with a clinician. If you obtain those by just getting them mailed to you from somewhere without a visit to a clinician and follow instructions that are available now online, then that's considered a self-managed abortion. And so some self-managed abortions could be quite safe because there are quite a few instructions about how to make sure that you're taking it within the window that is safe, that you take them in the right order, and all of those types of things. So it will become more and more of an option for many women who live just too far from any service and don't have any other options to obtain their abortion.
Yeah, the availability of mifepristone has been a game changer and really will change things compared to the pre-Roe days where, people didn't have these options. Looking at the questions, please continue to send them in.
I can address one that just came in about how quickly the trigger bans will go into effect. It depends on how the state law is written. Often it's the attorney general or somebody else in the state has to certify that Roe has indeed been overturned. And then there's, and then it will go into effect. So some are, as soon as the attorney general does that, some are 30 days after. I haven't seen anything as long. The question asked if it was 30 days or 60 days. I haven't seen anything as long as 60 days, but it's going to be state specific on how their law is actually written. But it's not, the second the decision is issued, usually there's something that needs to happen.
And this, I guess, is for both Ashley and Lori. One of the questions, and I've seen this come up a lot, is around kind of what are the implications of this decision for contraception and for birth control. Ashley, if you could talk a little bit more about kind of the confusion we found around, emergency contraception and medication abortion, and then Lori, a little bit about what some of the legal concerns have been.
Yeah. So what we're finding is that the environment is ripe for misconceptions around emergency contraceptive. And so if it is framed as a medication abortion, people may be more likely to support restricting access. We find that only about 4 in 10 incorrectly say that it's, that Plan B emergency contraceptive is the same thing as an abortion pill. But we have 3/4 that say it can end a pregnancy, and that is not true. And so, if it's framed as something that can end a pregnancy, it does mean that our polling has shown that you would maybe more likely to support restricting access to emergency contraceptive.
From the legal standpoint, I think it depends on exactly how the court words the decision. So in the short term, the immediate concern is that states are going to confuse this and think that emergency contraception is an abortion, and that if they believe that, is that enough for them to ban it as an abortion? Or do the FDA rules on its classification as a contraception and not as an abortifacient, does that pertain, and how will that play out? In the longer term, obviously, there's a lot of concern around just privacy rights in general, and the right to contraception, as decided in Griswold, could be the next court decision. All of these decisions around how we live our private lives are from the same realm of cases. So Griswold, and then the right to marry, and the right to have your family the way you want your family. All of those decisions are potentially will be brought in future cases, depending on how the court actually words this decision.
Yeah, this is an area I think, we've been seeing increasing states, the state legislators wanting to ban emergency contraception from their Medicaid program. The Texas Family Planning Waiver actually also bans emergency contraception. Even in the Hobby Lobby case, the objection was to emergency contraceptives in part, not just contraception in general. So I think we're likely to see a lot more activity in this area. And I think this is an area where we really need to focus kind of as a field about really making sure that people get good and accurate information. We have questions here about male responsibility. Have we seen anything, Lori, have you seen anything or any state action about male responsibility around abortion, around raising children at all, or foster children or any of that?
No.
And yeah, one of the other questions we have is around employers. And Lori, if you could talk a little bit about what kind of some employers' responses have been, and Ashley, maybe talk a little bit about what we found when we asked about mandating abortion coverage and travel.
Sure. So some employers, which have been making the rounds in a lot of media, have employees located in states that have either already banned, so in Texas and Oklahoma, or will quickly ban abortion if Roe is overturned, try and set up a way to help their employees travel to obtain an abortion. So there's travel funds. And then, of course, there's also the cost of the abortion. So some employers are also now going back and looking, do we cover abortion in our health plan? So we don't have an accurate count on how many employers are doing this, but the ones that are doing it very visibly, at least the ones that are in the media, to try and take a stand on this to some extent.
And Ashley, do you want to touch on a little bit more detail about what we found around the public response to employer requirements?
Absolutely. So first, we look at states that have that explicit protection for abortion access, and we find that 2/3 of the people living in those states support having a law that requires all employer provided health insurance plans to cover abortions. When we look at travel and paying for travel, it's a little bit more complicated and divided. So we only have about 51% of the public overall supporting the employer paying the cost for an employee to travel to another state to when seeking an abortion. And as you can imagine, this is so strongly partisan. So it's about 7 in 10 Democrats who support this. And on the other hand, 3/4 of Republicans oppose it. Independents are slightly more likely to support it than oppose it. But as you can see with that huge partisan divide, it is something that is really divided by party lines in terms of whether people support or oppose the employer paying the cost of an employee seeking an abortion in another state.
Lori, we have several questions here about criminalizing abortion. Can you talk a little bit more about what we've seen current state, if there are any current state laws right now that criminalize providers, and what we might, what's been kind of brewing in the state legislatures?
Sure. There are states right now that have jail time for clinicians that provide abortion past a certain gestational period. And so if you look at the trigger bans, many of them include jail time for clinicians. What's different, though, is that up until now, most states have not provided any criminal penalties to the person obtaining the abortion. And some of that is changing now. There's also a shift in terms of exceptions. In the past, it's been pretty standard to have exceptions for life, rape, and incest. And we're seeing the rape and incest exceptions disappear, and the life exception is maintained. So in addition, we're just going to see exactly how this gets played out, and if they really will go after people seeking abortions. It seems like that might not be a popular thing to do. But the idea is that the fear of these criminal penalties will be enough to stop clinicians and stop people from seeking abortions.
Great, thank you. I would encourage you to continue. We have a few more minutes left to submit questions here. I have a question here. I'm not sure, Lori, if you understand the question around the, yesterday, there was a letter that the Democratic senators sent to the Biden administration. One of, I guess, the proposal was vouchers for people to travel across. What are the issues there? Does that affect Hyde, and how would that
That's a great
really
question.
play out.
So just so everyone knows what HIDE is, it's an amendment that's been attached to the budget that restricts federal funds from being used to pay for abortions outside of those three exceptions: life, rape, and life endangerment. And it's passed every year. And this past year was the first time that the House had actually passed a budget without it attached. So the question is, if you pay for travel funds for people to cross state lines to obtain an abortion, would that run afoul of HIDE? And I think the answer is probably yes, but it's not something I've studied. So it's a very interesting question. And if if at this moment there might be more energy around not including HIDE, if so many states are going to ban abortion and the federal government needs to step in to at least provide travel funds. That might be a moment where the politics around HIDE might have shifted.
Can you talk a little bit about what resources actually do exist right now for people who have to travel long distances? I mean, already, even though, Roe v. Wade is still in effect, we still have the fact that, we do have the HIDE Amendment. And in many states, low-income people can't get any assistance with the cost of their abortion or traveling. What's out there that's available for people?
Sure. So as I mentioned, there's employer-supported programs for their workers and their dependents that they're paying specifically for travel to obtain an abortion. And those programs are structured in different ways. And we don't really have any information right now on how often they're being used, because some people might not feel comfortable, depending on how it's set up, asking their employer for that assistance, but they do exist. There's also been abortion funds that have been around for a lot longer, and those are funded through private donations. And people basically access this abortion funds by calling one of these funds and saying, I need to travel, and can you help pay for it? And then some states, like I mentioned before, Oregon being one of them, are setting up their own state funds to help assist for people that need to travel, in addition to supporting the clinics themselves. Alina, you're muted.
We have to do at least one in one webinar or meeting. Somebody has to say you're muted. But I took care of that. This is a question related to telemedicine. Can you speak to what's regulated at the federal and state level regarding the delivery of telemedicine services? Maybe thinking about the federal versus state government ability to regulate telemedicine and how that works.
So generally, healthcare for this would be regulated at the state level, but because it's a medication that is being sought, the FDA has regulated the rules around mifepristone, and has, as I mentioned before, recently lifted the rule that it have to be dispensed in person. So from the federal standpoint, this medication can be dispensed through the mail or not in person. States are free to set up their own telehealth requirements, but generally those don't involve medication. And so again, we're at this juncture that is not seen in many other places. There's one case which doesn't really have to do with telehealth, but with the conflict between state law and the FDA that involved opioids, where Massachusetts wanted to regulate the opioid more stringently than the FDA had, and the manufacturer sued and won and said the FDA rules applied and the state wasn't allowed to regulate it more than the federal government was. So we don't have a lot of examples in this area. And because it's abortion and there's a whole line of cases around abortion and medication, it's complicated where the intersection between the state and federal jurisdictions intersect and where they overlap, and who has where the federal government would preempt state laws.
And then we have another question. I think we touched on it earlier around whether people can be penalized for traveling out of state to get an abortion, and how that.
So this is a big
and be enforced. Yeah.
This is a big gray area. I mean, states are clearly trying to do this, but clearly, we have the right to travel. We have interstate commerce. And so, it's going to be a fight between states that could end up in another Supreme Court case, because trying to regulate things outside of your state borders or telling your residents that they don't have the right to travel is not something that we've seen before. And it will be difficult to enforce at best.
Thank you. And then Ashley, somebody was asking around the kind of, how big do you think the bias is based on kind of looking at the framing of pro-life versus pro-choice, and how does that kind of play out when you kind of drill down the next level?
Yeah, I think, this is something I tried to allude to, that when talking about like opinions around abortion are nuanced and tied to personal identity, but also there's like a lot of gray area there. We ask people whether they identify as pro-choice or pro-life, but then we can also see like how that relates to their support versus of Roe being overturned, or whether their support for state level restrictions. And so what we find is a majority of Republicans, I think 63%, identify as a pro-life, but that doesn't mean that they think abortion should be illegal in all cases, right? So it just means that they may support some state level restrictions, some restrictions. We know that they support that 24-hour waiting period, the fetal heartbeat bans, and less so, but nearly half support, criminalizing physicians that are providing abortion. So there are nuances there, but it really, people for a long time, these pro-choice and pro-life labels have become so tied up to their identity, and they haven't evaluated, okay, so what does that mean? At what point do I support a restriction, right? Or am I one of those that think the minority think it should be illegal in all cases? So that's one great thing about our polling, is that we don't just go into those like pro-life, pro-choice, and we can really dive deeper into these very minutia of details and restrictions.
Yeah, it was interesting to me the extent to which people opposed criminalization of both people getting abortion and clinicians. And I just wondered, kind of given your really considerable experience polling, do you think we get to a point where it's like an overreach and it's like too far and people are concerned they might start voting because, against restrictions or against candidates who support it because they feel like it's an overreach?
Yeah, I saw that other question about, that people were surprised that Republicans don't support criminalizing women. But if you think about it, they don't want to be placing the blame on the woman seeking an abortion. They're not supporting giving these individuals jail time or considerable fines. What they want to do is make it harder for people to access abortions. And so if that means like additional restrictions within their state. And so we did ask, whether they think people living in these states, these 17 states, whether they think it's going to be easier or more difficult for people to access to abortions, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. And Republicans are more likely to say, yeah, it's going to be harder and it's a good thing. And so that's where they want the policies to be. They want to make it harder for people to access abortions, but not necessarily going as far as criminalizing women that are other individuals that are getting abortions. So.
Great. Well, thank you. Unfortunately, I see we are out of time. And I really want to thank Ashley and Lori for a very wide-ranging Q&A. This issue has polarized our nation, and it's likely to continue to be a front-burner issue for years to come. The debate is going to move more directly to the states now, should the court overturn Roe v. Wade. And of course, candidate positions on abortion are going to become even more central to policy debates. Again, I want to thank Ashley and Lori for a really thought-provoking discussion, and to the audience for some terrific questions. This briefing has been recorded and it's going to be available on kff.org later in the day. And I would encourage you, for more information about this and other KFF tracking polls, as well as abortion and reproductive health policy research, we are going to be polling on this, and we are also going to continue to do our work on this in the months and years to come. Please check kff.org frequently. Thank you so much.